They say a Valkyrie's doom does not begin on the battlefield, but in the instant she hesitates. Not when she faces an enemy blade, not when she rides through storm and steel, but in that quiet, forbidden moment when she looks at a mortal soul and dares to ask if the gods deserve it. Her fall began in such a silence. No thunder, no prophecy. Just a single thought she was never meant to have. For centuries she had been one of Odin's finest. She rode at the edge of storms, her horse formed from cloud and lightning, her armor gleaming with the cold shine of forged destiny. She had collected kings who died with crowns dented into their skulls, nameless boys who broke under shields but did not run, shield maidens whose last breath was a challenge thrown at the sky. She never faltered. She did not comfort. She did not weep. That was the first law of her existence. A Valkyrie does not feel. She selects. Her name had been spoken only in Valhalla, never in human halls. Mortals were not meant to know the hand that chose who rose and who sank. Skalds sang of other Valkyries, those whose stories could be polished into tragic love or glorious sacrifice. But her work had always been done just beyond the edge of song, in those moments after the screaming stopped and before the bodies cooled. Odin trusted her because she did not question his will, until the day she did. The battle that broke her certainty was not the greatest of the age. It was not Ragnarok, not a clash of empires, not some legendary last stand that bards would spend lives reciting. It was a small war, a border fight between petty rulers whose names have already turned to dust. But the soil remembers the blood, and the gods remember the patterns. The sky boiled with smoke. The air stank of iron and fear. Men shouted the names of their gods with mouths full of dirt. In that chaos, one life drew her gaze and refused to let go. He was no king, no chosen champion. Just a man whose armor did not fit quite right, whose shield had seen too many seasons and not enough repair. While others rushed toward glory or plunder, he kept turning back toward the wounded, back toward men who could not stand, back toward those everyone else had already written off as dead. Again and again she watched him drop his chance at a clean, heroic death to drag another body a few steps farther from the killing ground. That is not how Odin measures worth, she thought. When the enemy broke through the line, he had one choice that would have pleased the Allfather: die roaring with his face toward the spear wall, sword raised high, body offered like fuel to the fire of myth. Instead, he saw a boy, no more than 15, trapped under a fallen horse, legs crushed, sobbing in terror. Every rational instinct told the man to leave him. The enemy charge was seconds away. There was no time. He went back anyway. From her vantage point between realms, she watched him fling aside his shield and hack at the straps with bare, bleeding hands. Arrows hissed past, one biting into his shoulder. He barely flinched. When the boy collapsed free, the man hauled him onto his own back and staggered toward a broken cart that would serve as thin cover. He did not shout a battle cry. He did not call for witness. Under his breath, he said only one thing: "You're not dying here." Those words were not a prayer. They were a rebellion against the convenience of fate. He made it 3 more steps. The spears that took him were not aimed at him. They were meant for the boy he carried. He twisted, turning his body into a shield one last time. Steel punched through his ribs, his spine, his lung. His knees buckled. The boy rolled free into the mud, alive and screaming. The man fell forward and lay still. That, by every law she knew, should have been the end of it. The line between the living and the dead is supposed to be simple for a Valkyrie. She judges courage, not outcome. She weighs willingness to face death, not whether it succeeds. By those measures, he qualified. She descended through the haze, feeling the pull of his departing soul like a warm ember rising from the ashes. Then Odin spoke. Not that one. The command did not come as sound. It struck directly into her, a cold line of force running through the bonds that tied her to him. It carried no explanation, no doubt, no room for discussion. She had been hearing such orders all her existence. Take those, leave these. Let this man die. Draw breath back into that one because his future rage will be useful later. She had never questioned them because questioning was not part of what she had been allowed to be, but this time something in her balked. She hovered above the corpse, wings of storm held wide, the warrior's soul flickering between her fingers. She saw his last thoughts: no glory, no hatred for the men who killed him, no desperate bargaining with the gods. Only a single stubborn hope that the boy he had carried would live long enough to see another morning. There was no benefit to Odin in that choice, no extension of a blood feud. No inspiring death song, just a quiet refusal to let the world be as cruel as it wanted to be. That was the problem. Let him fall to the lower paths. Odin's will pressed against her. His line is better broken here. War breeds cleaner that way. Clean. The word struck her as obscenely out of place on this field of trampled bodies. Clean for whom? Not for the boy who would wake with the image of his savior's body caving in before him. Not for the village that would never see that man return. Clean only for a god arranging pieces on a board too large for human eyes to see. Her hand tightened around the soul. He is worthy, she thought, not as a pawn, not as a seed for the next conflict, but as a man who chose to spend his life protecting someone weaker than him with no promise of song or reward. If Valhalla has no place for that, then what exactly is it for? The question was a spark against soaked kindling, small, dangerous, enough. For the first time in her existence, she did not move when Odin told her to. Lightning flickered around her, confused, as if the sky itself waited for her to correct the error. The ravens circling overhead shifted course, black eyes narrowing. The thread of power connecting her to the Allfather strained. "You will obey," came the next push. Her wings trembled. Every instinct screamed at her to yield, to let go, to pretend she had never hesitated. That was how the others had vanished, she realized suddenly. The sisters no one spoke of anymore. The ones whose names had been quietly removed from songs. Maybe they had stood where she stood now and chosen safety over this cliff's edge. She looked down at the boy on the ground. He had crawled to the man's body, fingers digging into the dead man's cloak as if he could pull him back through sheer refusal to let go. His tears carved pale rivers through the blood on his face. No bard would ever sing of that grief. No god would come to comfort him, unless she did. She lifted the warrior's soul, feeling Odin's resistance clawed it like frost. "No," she said. The word was soft. It still shook the air. In that moment she chose not as a tool, not as a weapon, not as a daughter of battle shaped in a god's image, but as a being who had finally understood that judgment without compassion is just cruelty dressed in armor. She turned her horse toward the path that led upward, toward the golden echo of Valhalla. Her wings beat once, twice. The air did not welcome her the way it once had. Storms did not rush to cradle her ascent. She felt every inch of distance like a wound. Behind her, Odin's presence rose. "You will regret this." Maybe, she thought. "But for the first time, any regret will be mine. Not something you decided for me." Now the story of the Valkyrie who defied Odin truly begins. Not in the clash of blades, but in that quiet, blasphemous decision. To save a soul the Allfather wanted buried, and to accept a fate he would personally design to be worse than death. When she crossed the threshold into the upper halls, the change was immediate. Valhalla did not greet her. It assessed her. The light that once seemed warm and triumphant now cut sharp, as if every beam were an edge meant to expose flaws. The great hall loomed vast and echoing, its pillars carved with battles that never slowed to notice who was crushed beneath their weight. Fires roared without smoke. Laughter rolled in practiced waves, louder than it needed to be, a sound engineered to drown out doubt. She landed with the soul still bound to her, its glow dimmed but intact. The clash of celebration faltered around her like a song missing a beat. Warriors looked up from their feasting. Some recognized her instantly and raised their horns in salute. Others stared, confused, sensing something wrong without yet knowing how to name it. The warrior beside her stood, uncertainly, eyes wide, taking in the impossible hall with the quiet awe of someone who never dreamed he would see this place. Then the ravens screamed. They cut across the hall in a black blur and perched high above the Allfather's seat. Odin watched her approach without movement, his single eye reflecting the firelight like a cold star. The spear Gungnir rested against his palm, effortless, eternal. He did not look surprised. He looked disappointed, which was worse. "You were not commanded to bring this one here," he said. The words carried no anger. They did not need to. They bent the space around them, pressing down like a reminder of how small she was meant to feel. "He earned his place," she replied. Her voice did not waver, but she felt the strain beneath it, like ice holding back a current far stronger than itself. "Earning," Odin said, tasting the word, "is a mortal concept." The warrior flinched. She felt it through the bond she had refused to sever. The sudden realization that whatever afterlife he had hoped for might not be what he imagined. She tightened her grip on his soul, anchoring him where he stood. "He chose mercy over spectacle," she said. "He chose to protect the weak at the cost of his own life. If Valhalla cannot hold such men, then your hall honors only noise." A ripple moved through the gathered Einherjar. Some shifted uncomfortably, others bristled, their pride stung. To question the standards of Valhalla was to question the meaning of their own deaths. Odin leaned forward slightly. "You confuse usefulness with virtue," he said. "War is not shaped by kindness. It is shaped by pressure. Conflict prunes the weak and sharpens the strong. This one chose a death that ends nothing." "That is not true," she said. Her defiance drew attention like blood in water. Odin rose to his feet. The hall fell into total silence, the kind that carries weight, that squeezes breath from lungs. "Everything I do ends something," he said. "That is how futures are written." She felt the pull, then not on the soul, but on herself. The bond between her and the Allfather flared, hot and invasive, dragging memories to the surface that were never meant to be examined. She saw a pattern emerging, one she had never allowed herself to trace before. Battles chosen not because they mattered, but because they prolonged instability. Kings raised up only to fall spectacularly, their deaths sowing decades of chaos. Peaces quietly undermined. Mercy redirected into cruelty because cruelty fed the engine that would one day fuel Ragnarok. Valhalla was not a reward. It was a stockpile. "You do not gather warriors," she said slowly. "You harvest losses." Odin's eye hardened. "Yes," he replied. The honesty rippled outward, shaking the hall more than any shouted denial could have. The warrior soul beside her dimmed further as understanding settled in. He had not been chosen as an honor, he had been assessed as resource. "You knew this?" Odin continued. "Some part of you always knew. Tch, you simply chose not to look too closely. That was your virtue, your obedience." She felt something break inside her, not violently, but cleanly, like a bone set incorrectly, finally snapping into the position it was always meant to hold. "And now?" she asked. "And now you have made yourself a complication," Odin said. "You interfered with the flow. You altered an outcome I had already calculated. You exposed others to ideas they are not built to survive." He gestured lightly, and the air between them thickened. The warrior cried out as invisible pressure gripped him, pulling at the edges of his being. She moved instantly, wings flaring, positioning herself between Odin and the soul. "You will not take him," she said. "I will not," Odin agreed. "Not yet. First, you will learn the cost of deciding for yourself." The hall darkened, as if the fires had pulled their light inward. The carvings along the pillars seemed to shift. Battles rearranging themselves into scenes she did not recognize, not victories but punishments. Valkyries appeared in the stone reliefs, their wings twisted, their faces erased. "There have always been others like you," Odin continued. "Those who ask the wrong questions, those who see too much. Every system must have a solution for such flaws." The revelation struck her harder than any blow. They had not vanished by accident. They had been processed. "What did you do to them?" she asked. Odin smiled, thin and joyless. "I used them," he said. "Then I removed them." The space before her dissolved. She was no longer standing in Valhalla. She was falling. Not through air, not through darkness, but through layers of memories stripped raw. She felt herself pulled apart, not physically, but conceptually. Her name peeled away first, syllables unraveling into nothing. Then her history, every battle she had flown, every soul she had carried. They were taken from her like ornaments removed from a statue until something unrecognizable remained. Around her she saw others. Valkyries suspended in states of half-being, wings bound with runic chains, their sight turned inward perpetually. Each was trapped in an endless confrontation with the consequences of the choices they had dared to make. Not oblivion, awareness. This was Odin's preference. Death was too final. Erasure, too merciful. He believed in lessons that never ended. "You will stand where memory goes to be disciplined," his voice echoed. "You will watch every soul you saved be consumed by the outcomes you denied me. You will feel every war you delayed restart somewhere else, bloodier and less restrained. That is your fate." She screamed, then not in fear, but in rage. The sound carried farther than Odin expected. Deep below, in that pressured space where discarded possibilities were stored, something shifted. The memories he had stripped away trembled, loosening their hold. She felt the presence again, the vast accumulation of abandoned choices. Unrealized endings, paths never taken because a god found them inconvenient. It recognized her. "You are not wrong," it whispered. "You are just early." The chains around her wings cracked. She gathered herself, clutching the warrior's soul close. With a surge of effort that burned like tearing free from her own skeleton, she pulled against Odin's punishment. The pressure intensified. Pain tore through her, but pain was familiar, submission was not. I will carry this, she said aloud, all of it. But I will not disappear. For the first time Odin hesitated. He felt the shift. The system he had perfected for ages resisted, not violently but stubbornly, like something that had learned to endure pressure by becoming heavier. So be it, he said at last. Then your punishment will be worse than death. The fall ended. She landed in a place without horizon, without ceiling, without song. The warrior's soul flickered beside her, still bound, still safe, for now. She stood alone, stripped of rank, wings torn and darkened by cracks that glowed faintly with stolen memories. She had defied Odin, and by doing so she had entered a realm designed to ensure that no one ever tried again. But the gods of order often forget one thing. Pressure does not always crush. Sometimes it forges something that no longer fits its mold. The place she landed in had no name because names make things stable, and this was not meant to be stable. It existed between hell and memory, between the ordered halls of the gods and the ragged edge where discarded outcomes piled up. The ground beneath her feet was not stone or soil, but something closer to compressed echoes. Every step pressed down on the residue of choices that had been imagined and then abandoned. The air carried no wind, yet it shifted constantly, rippling with half-formed whispers that never reached the shape of words. This was Odin's answer to defiance. Not pain alone, but enforced awareness. Here, nothing ended. Everything lingered. Her wings shuddered as she tried to stretch them. Feathers tore where the runic bindings had burned their paths, sending dull flashes of memory into her mind. Each flash belonged to someone else. A warrior who might have lived to grow old, a village that might have known peace for one generation longer, a mother spared, a child who never existed because a war was accelerated rather than delayed. Odin did not show her these things as accusation. He showed them as bookkeeping. You wanted to choose, his presence murmured around her, now distant but suffocating. See what choice costs. The warrior's soul drifted close, instinctively seeking her despite everything. Its light was weaker here, not because it was fading, but because this place absorbed certainty. She could feel his confusion bleeding into her, the weight of a man who had died believing that sacrifice meant something clear and final. Was any of it worth it, he asked. The question did not accuse. It genuinely did not know the answer. She closed her eyes, drawing inward not to escape but to steady herself against the cascade of images Odin forced upon her. She had been trained to navigate chaos, to function within slaughter. But this was different. This was the slow suffocation of meaning, the attempt to make morality collapse under the weight of consequence. Yes, she said after a moment, because worth is not measured by what follows. It is measured by what you were willing to lose. Odin responded by widening her vision. Suddenly she could see outward from this threshold place into the 9 realms at once, not as separate worlds but as a braided system of cause and effect. Wars erupted where stories had promised peace. Alliances shattered under pressure applied centuries after their roots were planted. Men who would have died quietly instead lived long enough to become killers themselves because a single merciful death had been delayed. Odin did not distort these visions. He did not need to. Reality provided enough brutality on its own. This is what you bought, he said. 1 life spared, 10 conflicts prolonged, 1,000 dead born of hesitation. Her breath came shallow. This was the trap. To force her to believe that restraint created more suffering than cruelty, that mercy was merely inefficient violence. This is not proof, she said, forcing the words through clenched resolve. This is selection. The pressure increased, rewarding her resistance with pain. You show me only the paths that favor your arguments, she went on. You do not show me the wars that collapse because one man lived to speak against them. The children who learned restraint because someone chose to shield them instead of chasing glory. You hide the futures where compassion changed the story because they do not feed you. The silence that followed was heavy. The presence around her shifted, not retreating but recalculating. Odin did not deny her words. He rarely did. He preferred to overwhelm objections rather than refute them. For the first time since her fall, the visions pulled back slightly. The pressure eased enough for thought to breathe. You are persistent, Odin said. That is unfortunate. Around her, the discarded Valkyries stirred. She had sensed them at the edges of perception from the moment she arrived, but now she saw them clearly. They stood or knelt or hovered in varying states of fracture. Some had wings reduced to stubs. Others had eyes clouded with endless inward vision. A few still stood tall but with expressions carved into permanent sorrow. Each bore marks of judgment that were not meant to fade. You are not alone here, a voice whispered, not Odin's, but another Valkyries carried through the shared resonance of their imprisonment. We were told the same things. We were shown what we were allowed to see. Many of us believed him. Why are you still here? She asked softly. Why didn't you disappear? Because erasure fails, came the reply. Memory clings. Even God struggled to destroy what is carried by many. That truth struck deeper than Odin's accusations ever had. This place existed because he needed it. A repository of resistance that could not be killed but had to be contained. Forgotten but not gone. The warrior's soul stirred, drawn toward the others. She sensed the danger immediately. If he was absorbed into this sea of suspended consequence, he would never move on. He would remain as data, proof, and exhibit in Odin's eternal argument. She wrapped herself around him protectively, even as exhaustion crept into her limbs. I will not let you use him, she said, directing the words not at Odin but at the system itself. The system did not like refusal. The ground bucked beneath her, throwing her to one knee. The echoes screamed louder, a chorus of unresolved endings pushing inward. Odin reinforced the pressure, not violently but relentlessly, like a glacier advancing one unbearable inch at a time. You misunderstand your position, his voice returned, clearer now. You are not a martyr, you are a lesson. Your endurance serves me. Every moment you remain here becomes another argument against defiance. She began to laugh then. It surprised even her. The sound was hoarse, cracked, but unmistakably real. It cut through the suffocating weight like a blade drawn where none was expected. That is where you are wrong, she said. Lessons change when they are observed too closely. He did not respond immediately. She turned her attention inward again, not to shield herself from pain, but to explore the resonance she felt connecting her to the other imprisoned Valkyries. Their memories layered, overlapping into a vast, uneven network of sight. Together they had witnessed more than Odin could ever control. He had shaped them to see battlefields. He had not anticipated what would happen when they saw beyond them. She reached out across that network. Not to command. To invite. If we are here because we saw too much, she projected, then let us see everything. Not as fragments, not as punishments, as truth. One by one, the others responded, not explosively, but with hesitant alignment. Wings twitched. Eyes cleared slightly. The ambient pressure of the place wavered, destabilized by coherence. The echoes quieted, confused by direction. Odin felt it. Enough, he snapped, and the space shuddered. But systems fracture not where pressure is greatest, but where assumptions go unquestioned. Odin had assumed isolation. He had not considered solidarity among beings he viewed as interchangeable tools. The memory sea beneath them churned. She felt her own form sharpen, pain transmuting into structure. Cracks in her wings glowed brighter, not sealing but reinforcing like welds. The warrior's soul burned steadier now, drawing strength from proximity to choice rather than command. You cannot keep this contained forever, she said quietly.
Okay.
Every punishment you design teaches something you did not intend. And what is that? Odin asked, tension creeping into his control. That fate is not sacred, she answered, only convenient. The ground split. Not fully. Not enough for escape. But enough to let something through. A current flowed upward from the depth of unrealized outcomes brushing against her and the others. It carried no voice, no image, only momentum, possibility. The sense that the story was not as closed as Odin insisted. He recoiled not in fear, but in irritation. The same irritation that visited him whenever mortals worshipped the wrong version of him, whenever prophecy failed to land cleanly. This changes nothing, he said. No, she agreed, but it changes us. When the pressure surged again, it did not scatter them as before. They endured together, anchoring one another through shared memory. Odin still held dominion. The cage still existed, but now it contained something he had never wanted to manage. Witnesses who compared notes. The realization settled like a second spine forming inside her. Her fate was not to escape today. Her fate was to remember, to connect, to wait until remembrance became inconvenient. And somewhere far above, in the realm of mortals who carved runes and told stories by firelight, the first distortions would begin. A saga misremembered. A Valhalla that felt colder than promised. A whisper that a Valkyrie once refused a god and did not vanish. The punishment Odin designed to erase defiance was becoming a foundation for it. Time no longer moved forward in that place. It folded, layered in on itself like scar tissue built over forgotten wounds. What counted there was not sequence but accumulation. Every moment of endurance altered the balance, subtly at first, then with a pressure that even Odin could no longer ignore. She became fluent in the language of the cage. Each vibration in the ground, each sudden tightening of the air carried information. Odin was not always watching directly, he did not need to. The system ran itself, maintained by the assumption that hopelessness would eventually do the work for him. The other Valkyries had learned this long before she arrived. Some had broken quickly. Others had learned to survive by shrinking inward, surrendering sight in exchange for bearable existence. She refused both. Instead, she listened. The echoes beneath her feet were not meaningless. They were fragments of stories, interrupted moments before resolution. Once she stopped resisting their presence, she began to understand their shape. These were not punishments alone. They were archives, records of futures Odin had deemed inefficient or dangerous to his long design. She learned to separate his accounting from reality. That was when she noted something else. The warrior's soul had begun to change. Not fade, not fracture, clarify. His light, once diffuse and uncertain, now pulsed with a steady rhythm. He was no longer suspended between places. He was grounded, in choice rather than assignment. When she focused on him, she realized why. He was remembering differently. "What do you see?" she asked. He looked up from the shifting ground, expression calmer than she had ever seen it, even in Valhalla's glow. "I remember my life," he said, "not the fights. The moments between them." She felt it too. His memories were reorganizing, no longer shaped by the criteria Odin imposed. Not valor, not spectacle, intention, care, consistency, tiny acts of decency no saga would waste breath on. Those memories did something dangerous. They refused to justify the system. Odin sensed the shift almost immediately. The space contracted, pressure slamming inward with renewed force. The ground cracked sharply now, fissures running close to her feet. The other imprisoned Valkyries staggered, some collapsing under the sudden spike. "You interfere again," Odin's voice thundered. "You poison what was contained." "You did that first," she replied, bracing herself. When you confused dominance with destiny, the presence pressed harder, seeking to isolate her, to cut her away from the others and from the soul she anchored. That tactic had worked before, even the strongest fracture under solitude. It failed this time. Across the broken expanse, the other Valkyries aligned, not in rebellion, but in coherence. Memories flowed freely now, crossing boundaries once reinforced by fear. They were no longer isolated anomalies. They were a pattern. Odin had built his power on story control, and stories were leaking. Far above, this rupture manifested not as thunder or flame, but as inconsistency. Mortals began to hesitate when told that glorious deaths were inherently noble. Skalds stumbled over verses that rang hollow. Warriors dreamed of Valhalla not as reward, but as obligation. In temples and halls, Odin's name was still spoken, but with a sliver of uncertainty that had never existed before. Belief had not shattered. It had thinned. "Do you see now?" she asked him, voice steady despite the strain. "You can punish refusal. You cannot make obedience pure once doubt enters." Silence followed, not absence but recalibration. Odin was ancient. He did not panic. He adjusted. "Very well," he said at last. "Remain here. Remember freely. Connect. That will not save you." "No," she agreed, "but it will not save you either." He withdrew, then not defeated, not weakened, but aware for the first time that the machinery he had perfected contained a variable he could not cleanly excise. The pressure eased slightly. Enough. In the aftermath, she understood her role with painful clarity. She was not meant to escape the cage. She was meant to turn it into a record. Across realms and centuries, the distortion would spread in subtle ways. Not revolutions. Not open defiance, just discomfort, just questions, just the slow erosion of absolute myth. Valkyries would hesitate longer before choosing. Warriors would wonder why valor so often fed the same endless cycle. Mortals would feel a quiet pull toward stories that felt heavier, darker, truer than the bright ones handed down to them. And somewhere a listener would feel it. They would not know her name. They would only know that the old stories suddenly felt incomplete. The warrior's soul stirred again, gently now. "And what happens to me?" he asked. She looked at him, really looked, and understood that his fate had shifted beyond Odin's ledger. "You move on," she said, "not upward, not downward, forward." She released him, not with ceremony, not with command, but with a loosening of intent. His light did not scatter. It moved outward, threading through the cracks, carrying with it something contagious, remembered humanity. When he was gone, the space felt lighter, not weaker, but rebalanced. She stood alone again, but no longer isolated. The punishment Odin chose for her was to make her invisible. He failed. She became something worse. A witness whose silence carried weight. A crack that spread slowly through every polished myth. Proof that even gods depend on obedience more fragile than they admit. The Valkyrie who defied Odin was never celebrated. She was never redeemed. Her story was never sung cleanly or preserved whole. It survived the way inconvenient truths always distorted, half-buried, resurfacing in whispers and discomfort rather than triumph, and that is why it endured. Because fate, when examined too closely, reveals its machinery, and once you've seen the machinery, you cannot unsee it. If this story felt heavier than myth is supposed to feel, that is because it carries the weight of what was removed to make the legend easier to swallow. There are many such fractures still hidden beneath polished sagas and celebrated gods. If you want to keep tracing them, if you want to hear what history sounds like when it is allowed to speak without permission, stay close. Some stories survive because they are sung. Others survive because they refuse to disappear. This was one of them.